What if love isn't the sweetness you've always believed in, but a battlefield where every tender gesture conceals a silent struggle? Nietzsche saw romance not as a space of unconditional surrender, but as an arena where two wills meet and clash. For him, loving was never just wanting the best for another, but also wanting to inscribe yourself into them, mark your presence, impose yourself invisibly. When we look closely, we notice that even the most tender promises carry a need for recognition. A kiss can be affection, but it can also be possession. Jealousy might seem like care, but it's fear of losing territory. What if every declaration of love were actually a subtle power strategy? Nietzsche didn't seek to comfort passionate hearts. He wanted to expose what's most raw and instinctive behind what we call romance. This is a journey for those brave enough to see love without masks. If this reflection resonates with you, subscribe to the channel and join this voyage into the darkest and truest heart of human relationships. Nietzsche never believed in love as a space of purity or sanctity. For him, what we call romance is just one of the most sophisticated forms of manifestation of what moves all life, the will to power. This idea might sound strange at first glance, because from early on, we were taught to think of love as surrender, as renouncing oneself in favor of the other. However, Nietzsche saw exactly the opposite. To love is, in essence, to desire to possess, to leave a mark, to conquer territory that, without this relationship, would remain inaccessible. The philosopher didn't deny the intensity of loving feelings. On the contrary, he recognized it as one of the strongest instincts, capable of elevating humans to ecstasy and also casting them into the deepest despair. But instead of idealizing it as something sublime, he saw it in its brutal nakedness. Love is struggle, force in motion, appropriation of another's life to strengthen one's own existence. Those who love don't dissolve into the other, as romantic poets suggest. Those who love desire to engrave their presence in the beloved, desire to be necessary, indispensable, even inevitable. When Nietzsche speaks of love, he's not thinking of a delicate feeling, but of a form of power that manifests almost imperceptibly. We need only observe our daily lives to perceive this. Think of an ordinary couple. When one says to the other, "You are everything to me," this phrase, though loaded with tenderness, also contains hidden poison. The desire for exclusivity, the implicit demand that the other become captive to this relationship. This declaration is simultaneously caress and prison, promise and demand. Nietzsche invites us to perceive that there's no neutrality in the act of loving. There's always behind it a deeper wanting that disguises itself as giving. He goes even further. Even the greatest demonstrations of sacrifice within a relationship are nothing but another form of will to power. A man who claims to be willing to give his life for the woman he loves isn't renouncing himself purely. He's, in a way, affirming his absolute power over the bond, showing how far he's capable of going to maintain his influence. His sacrifice is also a form of domination, because it makes the other person feel eternally indebted, eternally marked by that gesture. This perspective might seem harsh, even cynical, but Nietzsche had no interest in consoling hearts. His objective was to reveal the underground forces that govern life. For him, romantic love, as idealized by Christian tradition and 19th century poets, was nothing but a veil covering the most primitive instincts. What's at stake in romance isn't the purity of surrender, but the intensity of struggle, the conquest of space, the triumph of one's own will over another's. It's in this sense that Nietzsche spoke of love as egoism for two. The couple transforms into a unit that apparently seeks mutual well-being, but which in reality is sustained by two egos that constantly measure themselves, challenge each other, and try to mold one another. Passion, with all its intensity, is nothing more than the spark of this clash, the fire born from the collision between two forces that simultaneously attract and desire to dominate each other. If we pay attention to our own relationships, we'll see this isn't just abstract philosophy. When someone demands constant attention, when they demand messages, when they're offended by the other's absence, they're exercising a form of power. When someone strives to please excessively, expecting recognition and reciprocity, they're also subtly trying to impose their presence. Love isn't innocent. It's an arena where every gesture, every word, every silence carries intentions deeper than those appearing on the surface. Nietzsche believed that understanding this truth shouldn't lead us to despair, but to lucidity. By recognizing love as will to power, we stop deceiving ourselves with the illusion of total surrender and can see more clearly the games unfolding within each relationship. This recognition doesn't destroy love, but strips it bare, revealing that behind promises of eternity there's always a silent struggle. The question that remains then is, if all love is traversed by will to power, can any romance be truly free from domination? If at first glance love might seem like surrender, in Nietzsche's view, it's above all desire. And desire, far from being pure or naive, always springs from ego. When we desire someone, we don't do so merely because the other is beautiful or interesting, but because we project onto them a promise of completeness, of expansion of our own existence. To love, in this sense, is to want to incorporate into our own territory what we perceive as valuable. Nietzsche saw desire as an extension of will to power. One doesn't desire neutrally. To desire is, to some extent, to want to appropriate, to want the other to become part of oneself, to want to mold them to our own measure. Romance, then, isn't just a meeting of souls, but a constant negotiation between two wills striving to affirm their presence. Let's think of a simple situation. Someone begins a relationship full of enchantment. Initially, there's easy laughter, complicity, a sensation of discovery, but gradually, the need to define limits also emerges. Who can go out with whom? Who decides the direction of conversations? Who has the power to say, "I didn't like that"? In every detail of daily life, there's a silent dispute to see which ego will have more space, which desire will have priority. Nietzsche pointed out that even the most subtle forms of affection hide this movement. When a person excessively praises their partner, it might seem like mere affection, but it can also be an attempt to mold their self-image, to make them dependent on that validation. When someone insists on knowing every step of the other, it might seem like concern, but it's actually a form of possession. This game is rarely perceived consciously because the mask of romantic love covers the crudest intentions. The ego, in this sense, is never satisfied with just loving. It wants to be loved back, wants to be recognized, wants its presence confirmed as indispensable. Desire doesn't content itself with contemplating, it demands response. That's why love is rarely peaceful. It always carries tension, waiting, demands. If the other doesn't return in the same measure, frustration is born. And frustration, in many cases, transforms into resentment. Nietzsche saw in this a reflection of the human condition itself. We are beings of lack, but also of conquest. We desire because we feel absence, but also because we want to expand our power. Romance, thus, becomes the most intense space of this contradiction. The lover wants to possess and simultaneously fears being possessed, wants to dominate, but also gets frightened by the idea of being dominated. This unstable balance is what gives love both fascination and suffering. In relationships, we can clearly observe this struggle of appropriation. How many couples don't get involved in long discussions about small choices? The restaurant to visit, the trip destination, the tone of clothes worn to a party. At first sight, these are trivial details, but they carry hidden meaning. Who has more influence over decisions? Who dictates the relationship's direction? Each choice is symbolic territory in dispute. And the ego, even disguised as generosity, constantly seeks to guarantee its victory. Nietzsche didn't see this as a moral defect. For him, it wasn't about condemning egoism, but recognizing its inevitability. Humans can't love without ego, because love is precisely the expression of ego seeking affirmation. When someone says, "You are my life," they reveal more than tenderness. They reveal that the other has become emotional property, an essential part of their own sense of existing. This perspective doesn't eliminate love's beauty, but places it on another level. If we can see that loving is also appropriating, we begin to understand relationships' inevitable conflicts. We stop expecting non-existent purity and begin dealing with the reality of human desire. Love isn't just encounter, it's conquest. It's not just surrender, it's appropriation. Perhaps Nietzsche's great provocation is precisely this: accepting that romance is never a neutral space, but a field where two forces meet to measure their potency. And in this encounter, ego's desire always seeks to mark territory. The question that echoes is, can we love someone without at some moment trying to mold them in our image? Few ideas are as seductive as that of altruistic love. We grew up hearing that to love is to give without expecting anything in return, to surrender entirely to the other, to live for their happiness. This vision, deeply rooted in Christian tradition and romantic narratives, seems to offer the promise of pure, elevated love, free from egoism. But for Nietzsche, this promise is nothing but a dangerous illusion. According to the philosopher, no human gesture is exempt from the desire for affirmation. Even the most generous act hides at its root the will to be recognized, to be important, to leave a mark. When someone sacrifices for another, this sacrifice, far from being a negation of ego, is actually one of its most sophisticated forms of expression. Altruism, in this sense, would be just a more delicate mask of the same struggle for power that governs all relationships. Let's think of a simple example. A person dedicates their entire life to their partner, renounces projects, gives up opportunities, adapts their routine in the name of love. Apparently, this seems like a gesture of absolute abnegation, but in depth, this sacrifice also becomes a form of demand. The other comes to bear the weight of that dedication, the symbolic debt of corresponding to such great effort. The altruist, even if they don't perceive it, creates a trap. Their gesture of surrender places them in a position of moral superiority, as one who silently says, "Look how much I did for you." Nietzsche believed this type of love wasn't purer, but more dangerous. Because while openly possessive love shows its face without disguises, altruistic love operates in shadows, creating almost invisible bonds of dependence. It doesn't imprison with explicit chains, but with the weight of gratitude, debt, obligation. To love in this case isn't to free the other, but to make them eternally hostage to a gesture of supposed generosity. If we observe daily life, we'll see this logic is common. A partner who constantly reminds of efforts made for the relationship. A mother or father who demands recognition for sacrifices made. A friend who helps but expects unconditional loyalty in return. In all these cases, what seems altruism is actually a subtle calculation of power. It's not pure love, but love conditioned on response, recognition, validation. Nietzsche thus breaks with the romantic vision of love as abnegation. For him, we wouldn't love if there weren't something to gain. This gain might be pleasure, companionship, sensation of importance, or even the illusion of being good. But in any case, there's always symbolic currency at play. To love, therefore, is never giving into void. It's always also expecting something in return, even if this return is just the intimate satisfaction of feeling generous. This might seem disappointing, but for Nietzsche, it's an invitation to honesty. Instead of believing in an unattainable ideal of altruistic love, we can face reality. Every relationship is traversed by interests, desires, power exchanges. Recognizing this doesn't destroy the bond, but makes it truer. Because the worst mistake is pretending there's no egoism where it clearly exists. Altruistic love, according to Nietzsche, is a myth that serves more to feed illusions than to strengthen relationships. When we believe in it, we end up frustrated because no partner can correspond to this expectation of purity. We demand selfless love, but we ourselves aren't capable of offering it. This contradiction generates resentment, accusations, disillusions. By revealing that altruism is just another form of egoism, Nietzsche invites us to a new posture, not to love less, but to love with more lucidity, to admit that even in the most generous gesture, there exists a desire for affirmation, and that this doesn't need to be a problem as long as it isn't denied. Love, when seen without illusions, can be freer, because it stops sustaining itself on false promises and begins supporting itself on mutual recognitions of strength, desire, and limitation. Thus, the great question Nietzsche poses is, when you give yourself in a relationship, are you really thinking of the other, or just seeking, in a disguised way, to reinforce your own importance? If even so-called altruistic love bears the mark of will to power, it's in jealousy and the pain of betrayal that this dynamic reveals itself most crudely. For Nietzsche, nothing shows so clearly the instinct of possession in romance as the fear of losing the other. Jealousy, in this sense, isn't a demonstration of love, but an involuntary confession that the beloved has been transformed into property, into personal territory that cannot be invaded. When someone feels jealous, they're actually saying, "This being belongs to me, and I don't accept another exercising over them the influence I conquered." This reaction doesn't spring from generosity, but from the instinct of self-preservation and domination. Jealousy is the shadow of desire for power, a reflection of fear of seeing one's influence diminished. It's as if the presence of a rival, real or imaginary, put at risk the sovereignty one believes to have over another's heart. Nietzsche saw this movement as inevitable. Humans can't bear losing what they've incorporated into their identity. When someone loves, they invest so much of themselves in the other that they begin confusing boundaries. It's no longer just I and you, but a mixture where the other becomes an essential part of one's own value. Losing this territory is feeling diminished, almost destroyed. That's why the threat of betrayal is so devastating. It doesn't just wound trust, but the ego itself, which sees itself degraded before the possibility of being replaced. In daily life, jealousy appears in various forms. Sometimes as small questions disguised as care. Who were you with? Why didn't you answer me? Other times as explosions of rage, direct accusations, attempts at control. In any of these forms, what's revealed is the same fear of losing centrality in the other's life. And this fear for Nietzsche is the clearest proof that love is always struggle for power, because only those who desire to dominate fear so much the loss of dominion. Betrayal, in turn, is seen as the most violent rupture of this dynamic. It doesn't just introduce a rival, but destroys the illusion of exclusivity that sustains much of relationships. When it occurs, the betrayed suffers not just for the act itself, but because the entire symbolic edifice they had constructed crumbles. The we reveals itself fragile, the secret pact of power breaks, and the sensation of inviolable territory disappears. Nietzsche might say that betrayal's pain is, fundamentally, the pain of perceiving we never had the other completely, that the possession we believed absolute was only partial, and that the beloved always remained somehow free. This perception hurts more than infidelity itself, because it reminds us of an uncomfortable truth. No one belongs entirely to anyone. It's at this point that jealousy and betrayal expose the illusory character of love as eternal possession. If we live trying to guarantee absolute exclusivity, sooner or later we'll face the shock that the other is ultimately unreachable. We can conquer emotional territories, we can exercise influence, but we'll never completely hold the beloved's freedom. Nietzsche doesn't propose that we eliminate jealousy, but that we recognize it in its essence, as a natural manifestation of will to power. Instead of romanticizing it as proof of love, we should see it as a symptom of our hunger for dominion. Only then can we deal with it without masks, understanding that fear of loss is an inevitable part of loving, but doesn't need to become prison. Perhaps the most challenging question is it possible to love without this desire for exclusivity, without this obsession with total control? Can we accept the risk of loss without trying to suffocate the other? For Nietzsche, this would be the most elevated form of relationship, one where we recognize the struggle for power, but don't let it become tyranny. Jealousy and betrayal show us that love, far from being just tenderness, is also battlefield. But perhaps precisely there lies its greatness. To love is to risk oneself, to open oneself to the danger of loss, to face the fear of not being enough. And you, when you feel jealous, are you loving the other, or just trying to preserve the power you believe you have over them? If jealousy reveals the silent struggle for territory, there are moments when romance stops hiding its conflicted nature and transforms into declared war. Nietzsche saw life as combat, and love didn't escape this logic. To love is to live in tension, to experience both ecstasy and pain, to enter a field where two worlds clash and try to impose themselves upon each other. When masks fall, delicate gestures transform into weapons, and romance assumes its most brutal face. In relationships, this war doesn't manifest only in great discussions, but also in subtle, daily battles. There are those who use silence as sword, leaving their partner suffocated by absence of words. There are those who manipulate guilt, remembering past errors as a way to keep the other submissive. There are those who practice emotional blackmail, insinuating that the relationship's happiness depends entirely on their will. In these situations, what's at stake isn't just coexistence, but power. Every gesture is calculation, every word is strategy, every silence is a movement on the dispute's chessboard. Nietzsche would see in this not an aberration of love, but its very essence. To love is to fight, because to live is to fight. There's no harmony without tension, no surrender without resistance. The error isn't in the war's existence, but in refusing to recognize it. Couples who insist on believing in the illusion of constant peace end up surprised when conflicts emerge and interpret this as a sign of failure, when actually it's just the bond's nature revealing itself. This clash can be seen in everyday examples. Two lovers argue about who dedicates themselves more to the relationship. One accuses the other of coldness, and the response comes loaded with resentment, remembering old gestures of ingratitude. Gradually, words become ammunition, each memory a projectile, each accusation a frontal attack. It's not rare that in these moments, the relationship becomes a true trench, where both seek to survive without yielding, without admitting defeat. Nietzsche would say this play of forces is inevitable, because each individual is, in their essence, a will in expansion. Love doesn't erase ego. It only brings it dangerously close to another ego, equally eager for affirmation. That's why war emerges. because neither is willing to completely annul themselves, and when both desire to impose their mark, the relationship stops being refuge and becomes arena. But here's a crucial point. This war isn't necessarily destructive. For Nietzsche, combat is also creator. It's in the clash of forces that new forms of life emerge, new possibilities for growth. Love that transforms into war can, if it doesn't lead to destruction, lead to overcoming. Conflict can be a laboratory of transformation, where each learns about their limits, masks, hidden strategies. In this sense, loving war isn't just tragedy, but also opportunity for awakening. However, when struggle loses this creative character and transforms into tyranny, the relationship degenerates. When one completely dominates and the other submits, there ceases to be combat and only oppression exists. Love, then, dies, because the vitality sustaining it springs precisely from encounter between two forces that recognize themselves as rivals and simultaneously as necessary to each other. An unequal war destroys, but a balanced war can nourish. The great challenge, therefore, is recognizing when love has turned to war and deciding what to do about it. Some choose to flee, others surrender to resentment, still others learn to fight without wanting to destroy. Nietzsche might suggest that to love is to accept this risk, to accept that in every kiss there's also a silent battle, and that in every embrace there's an unstable pact between forces that never stop measuring themselves. Thus, when we say love turns to war, we're not saying it loses its essence, but that it reveals what it always was, a struggle where two beings seek to affirm their potency. Perhaps the real question isn't how to avoid this war, but how to fight so that combat doesn't annihilate, but strengthens. And you, when you fight in a relationship, do you fight to destroy the other, or to discover how far the strength of both goes? If Nietzsche showed that love is traversed by will to power, he didn't do so to condemn the feeling, but to expose it in its deepest truth. For him, love isn't pure, isn't altruistic, isn't a place of rest. It's struggle, appropriation, war of forces. But in recognizing this, a possibility of overcoming also opens, learning to love without imprisoning, without transforming the other into conquered territory. To love without possessing doesn't mean denying desire, nor eliminating the egoism inherent in human relations. That would be impossible. It means rather elevating love to a more conscious form, where one doesn't seek to erase the other's freedom, but on the contrary, celebrate it. It's loving knowing the other isn't an extension of oneself, but an independent force that can leave at any moment. This consciousness, though painful, is also liberating. Nietzsche saw the free spirit as one who doesn't fear loss, who doesn't need to hold the world with chains for it to remain. In love, this translates to the capacity to say, I want you, but I don't possess you. I love you, but I don't imprison you. I choose you, but I don't chain you. This type of relationship isn't more fragile for not guaranteeing possession. It's stronger because it sustains itself on truth. The challenge lies in abandoning illusions of total exclusivity and absolute altruism. While we believe love needs to be complete fusion or unconditional surrender, we'll live trapped in impossible expectations. And when these expectations aren't fulfilled, resentment, jealousy, and war will emerge. But when we accept that the other is irreducibly free, we learn to love without demanding guarantees. We love the instant, the presence, the encounter, not eternal possession. This doesn't mean love becomes superficial. On the contrary, it becomes more intense because it stops supporting itself on illusions and anchors itself in reality. A couple that loves without possessing lives in constant choice, not obligation. The relationship doesn't maintain itself through fear, but through renewed desire. There's no debt, only will. Each gesture is truer because it doesn't spring from the need to control, but from the joy of sharing. We can think of everyday examples. A partner who supports the other's freedom, even if this exposes them to risk of loss. A woman who allows the man she loves to follow his own paths without monitoring every step. A man who doesn't feel threatened by his partner's shine, but celebrates it, recognizing that her light doesn't diminish his. In these situations, love doesn't weaken through absence of possession. On the contrary, it strengthens in trust and lucidity. Nietzsche knew this type of love is rare because it requires courage. It's easier to want to trap, mold, watch. It's easier to yield to fear of loss than to face the truth that the other never belongs to us. To love without possessing is, therefore, a task for the strong, for those who can face life without needing eternal guarantees, for those who understand that love's beauty lies in its fragility and risk. Fundamentally, this is the same attitude Nietzsche preached toward life, an unconditional yes to the instant, even knowing it's temporary. To love without possessing is to say yes to the other as they are, not as we'd like them to be. It's accepting the play of forces without transforming it into tyranny. It's living love as dance, not as prison. Perhaps this is the only path for love not to destroy itself in war, not by eliminating struggle, but by transcending it, giving it another meaning. Love that doesn't seek possession isn't exempt from desire, but desires in a more elevated way. Desires that the other flourish in their own potency, even if this means moving away. Thus, Nietzsche invites us to a radical question. Do we have courage to love someone knowing we'll never possess them completely? Throughout this journey, we've seen how Nietzsche stripped love of its illusions. Romance, far from being pure giving, is traversed by desire, ego, fear of loss, jealousy, and even war. To love, for him, was never just tenderness. It was also struggle, appropriation, conflict. But recognizing this truth isn't love's end. It's the beginning of more lucid love. When we understand that even the most generous gesture carries will to power within it, we stop deceiving ourselves with fantasies of purity. And by abandoning illusions, the possibility of something greater emerges. Loving without possessing. Loving with courage, loving without chains. This is Nietzsche's invitation. Not easier love, but truer love that doesn't imprison, but awakens. And you, what belief about love has imprisoned you most until today? Comment here from where you're watching. If this reflection moved you, leave your like, subscribe to the channel, and share this video with someone who also needs to rethink what it means to love. Thank you for being part of this community that seeks to think about the human in its depth. Without masks, without illusions, with courage to face the truth.